Hello there. On behalf of SysGrip and the Chicago-based planning team, I have the pleasure of welcoming you to Aware for All. My name is Hope Venturcelli, and I am the Manager of Events and Community Engagement with SysGrip. SysGrip is a nonprofit organization that educates the public about clinical research. We do not conduct trials or recruit for trials, but we believe that everyone should have the information they need to be informed about clinical research. To make sure that this program is a meaningful educational experience for you, we ask for your feedback. Now let's look at why we're here today. Our ability to live long, healthy lives is due in large part to advances in medical treatments, advances that would not have been possible without the participation of volunteers in clinical trials. This past year, over 2 million people took part in over 80,000 clinical trials of drugs and procedures that treat, detect, and prevent disease and health problems. I want to also take this moment to acknowledge any of our audience members who have contributed and participated in clinical research. We thank you for your important contribution to advance medical science and health for all of us. At the close of this program, we would like to recognize all of our study volunteers, or as we like to call them, medical heroes, with a special ceremony. SysGrip was honored to collaborate on this important program with over 350 community and research organizations. These groups helped raise awareness and spread the word about the AWARE program. They expanded our reach and helped to contact thousands of people in the Chicago area to raise awareness about clinical research. You can visit many of these groups in our new interactive virtual health fair. I would also like to take a moment to recognize our planning team. For the last few months, these dedicated individuals have helped to organize today's virtual event. Without your help and support, this program would not have been possible. I also wanted to take a minute to recognize the SysGrip team, who has worked tirelessly to ensure that today's program is meaningful and educational. I'm so proud to be part of such a hardworking team. We would now like to thank our generous Aware for All sponsors, all of whom contributed funds and support to make today's program free and accessible to all. A very special thank you to the Aware Industry Consortium, Biogen, Boston Scientific, CSL Behring, EMD Serono, IQVIA, Janssen, Merck, Otsuka, Pfizer, and WCG for providing support and bringing this educational program to 5 cities this year. To our national sponsor, the Allergy and Asthma Network, and our local sponsors, Rush Institute for Translational Medicine and Advocate Aurora Health. Thank you all for continued support. In just a moment, I'll turn it over to Dr. Karriem Watson, who will provide an overview about clinical research. Right after that, Amber Holst from Great Lakes Clinical Trials will share some tips to improve memory and brain health. Then we'll turn it over to Dr. Lombard from Northwestern, who will lead us in a mindful meditation. After that, we will host a panel discussion with study volunteers and research professionals, sharing information about their roles in clinical research. We encourage you to send them questions through the chat box or by emailing awareforall@sysgrip.org. We will open with a Q&A directly following the panel discussion. We will conclude with our MedHero ceremony and host our raffle. Let's get started. A copy of our overview presentation called What Clinical Research Means to You is included in our digital handbook. There's a link to our research center right beneath the media player to download a copy and follow along. We will also send a link to view right after the event. This is a wonderful educational tool, and I encourage you to read it after the program and share it with your friends and family. It is my sincere pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Karriem Watson, Associate Executive Director of Miles Square Health Center at UI Health and Associate Director of Community Outreach and Engagement at UI Cancer Center out of UIC.
Thank you, Hope. I'd also like to welcome you to the first ever virtual Aware for All clinical research education event. We are thrilled that so many of you are agreeing to join us more to learn about clinical research virtually. We're excited that during these times, we've been creative and innovative in how we partner, but how we still continue to meet and the needs of our community members. I'd like to start with a few questions. Have you ever taken an allergy medicine? Have you ever given your child a pain reliever? Perhaps you have a friend or a family member who is a cancer survivor. If so, you can thank clinical research volunteers. Around the world, people are living longer, healthier lives because people they never met volunteered to take part in clinical research studies. And those studies help find ways to prevent, treat, and even cure certain medical conditions. We like to call these volunteers medical heroes. So most people don't understand what clinical research is about, and there's some people are afraid, and understandably so. They may think that clinical research volunteers are treated like, you hear this term often, guinea pigs, or they've heard stories about clinical trials that have gone wrong, and we've all heard that, or they still remember past abuses when there were no protections in place for clinical research volunteers. That's why SISCRIP and AWARE Chicago planning team believes in education before participation. We think that the more people understand the clinical research process, the more they'll appreciate those volunteers who participate in clinical research. So what we learn from clinical research studies improves public health. And it all starts with a question, with these questions rather. How does a disease progress, or how can it be prevented? How well does a new drug work or not work? Is there a better way to treat a disease? And then lastly, how do genes affect illness? Does where people live change their health? We often say that your zip code can be more important than your genetic code. So researchers can only answer these questions with the help of clinical research volunteers, hence why we call them medical heroes. So what is a clinical trial? It's a carefully designed study where researchers ask volunteers to do something. And that something could be like taking a part of a new drug or a treatment so they can answer a specific medical question. They may be asking, is the treatment safe? Does it improve a certain medical condition? Does it have side effects? How much should people take of that particular medication? And is it a better medicine than medicines that are already on the market? Because researchers are studying new investigational treatments, there are risks to participating in a clinical trial, but in all cases, something is learned from clinical research studies that helps to inform medical knowledge and improve public health. So it's also important to understand what being in a clinical trial is going to do, and that it's not the same as going to your doctor for care. So when you go to your doctor, he or she will give you treatment that already has been tested and approved by the government. This is called routine or standard of care, and I'm sure you've heard this term, standard of care. This is the care we know that works for most people. This is the care you would get if you go to your doctor for regular appointments or if you had a health problem. But you can fully understand something by studying just one, you can't fully understand something by studying just one group of people. We must make sure that we study, that the people that we study reflects the rich diversity in our country. That diversity, not just across race and ethnicity, but be about geography, where you live, what you eat, and what you do. That must all be represented in the diversity that we think of when we think about diversity in clinical trials. So for many years, most clinical trials were done on white men only. And this meant that groups such as African Americans, women, and other minorities were not included. But today, clinical trials welcome the participations of all people. And those clinical trials are closely monitored for their safe and ethical treatment of volunteers. We know that being male or female, young or old, race and ethnicity affects the way people respond to diseases and treatments. For example, Alzheimer's disease happens twice as often in women than men. Type 2 diabetes and asthma are common in African Americans, Hispanics, Latinx communities, Asian and white women, and white women are more likely to develop osteoporosis. And children respond differently than adults to some drugs. That's why scientists need all different types of volunteers for research. The more diverse participants are in clinical trials, the more the researchers learn about the different ways that people respond to medical treatments. It is essential, therefore, that diverse communities are adequately represented in clinical trials in order to understand disease and how to treat it among each unique population. We also think that diversity in clinical trial can address some of the medical mistrust that we talked about earlier. So next, I want you to consider that some people remember past abuses, like the U.S. public health study of syphilis in Tuskegee, Alabama, which we often inappropriately call the Tuskegee study. And I make an effort to say that we want to call that the U.S. public health study of syphilis in Tuskegee, Alabama. And this was a study in which treatment was withheld from African-American men for many years. Or the story of Henrietta Lacks is another one that we hear and know about, which we now commonly know as HeLa cells, one of the most commonly used cell lines in scientific research. These studies gathered information about patients without their consent or getting some type of remuneration for their participation. And people wonder if this could happen today. The answer is that not likely. Fortunately, there have been things put in place and federal guidelines and ethical practices that are in place to monitor the safety and to protect the rights of study volunteers. Today, the public and professionals are more aware than ever of the need to have diverse populations in clinical research. And when we are thinking about ways of how we can take steps to break down participation barriers, ways to improve diversity and pave the way for a healthier future for everyone, we think about activities like what we're doing today. But several studies have shown that underrepresented minority populations consistently demonstrate an equal or higher willingness to participate in clinical studies than do their white counterparts. Individuals within these communities have said that lack of access to clinical trials is the primary reason why they don't participate. This includes outreach and communication that has failed to reach them, health and research professionals not asking them to participate, clinical trials that are too far away, or participation requirements that are too difficult to follow. If we work together, we can solve these problems and make clinical trials far more accessible. So let's talk a bit about the different phases of a clinical trial, the different phases of a study, and how long it typically takes to advance a new therapy. So during phase 1 studies, a drug is tested for the first time with very small number of volunteers, and often these are healthy volunteers. The goal of these clinical trials is to learn what is a safe dose and how does it work in the body. Ask questions like, is it harmful? In phase 2 studies, researchers begin to understand how well a drug works and if it is safe for patients who have a specific disease or condition. One thing I want to note is that although we talk about safety a lot in phase 1, we never stop talking about safety throughout all the phases of a study. And when we think like phase 1, safety is still the main goal. Phase 2 studies look to answer such basic questions as how much of the drug or the treatment should people take, and what are the usual side effects. And only about 1/3 of drugs that enter clinical testing ever successfully complete phase 2 and progress to a larger group of patients in phase 3 studies. At this stage of phase 3, researchers may check the drug's safety and how well it works in different groups of patients. The trial may also compare the new drug with an already approved drug. Phase 4 studies happen after a treatment has been approved by the Food and Drug Administration, and they usually involve large number of patients. Phase 4 studies look like real-world experiences and checks to see if the drug works well over a long period of time. This clinical research process from phase 1 to 3 takes 7 or more years. So you've probably heard a lot in the news lately about the development of vaccines and treatments for COVID-19. Vaccines and treatments for infectious diseases usually takes 9 or 10 years to develop. This seems like a long time, but it is necessary for understanding the real effects of new therapy and determining whether it is safe and effective at specific doses or levels. The clinical trial process for COVID-19 treatments and vaccine is moving at a faster pace and may produce promising therapies within a few years. Some treatments and vaccines have a head start because they have been based on research that was being conducted for viruses that are similar to COVID-19. The pandemic has mobilized much higher levels of coordination between companies and government agencies, which has helped speed up the process. In the educational handbook that you will be receiving, you'll find a number of resources about COVID-19 studies and new therapies in development. So clinical trials can be sponsored by the government, academic medical centers, pharmaceutical companies, biotechnology companies, or medical device companies. And research involves a lot of people who do different things. Like members of a sporting team, clinical trials have coaches, players, and officials, and each person has an important role to play. So I'm really going to build out a little bit more as we think about this concept of thinking about clinical trial partners as being a part of a sporting team. So research involves a lot of people who do different things, like members, like I said before, like members of a sporting team. So the principal investigator is like the head coach of a team, and he or she is responsible for organizing and leading the study, as well as recording the study and studying the data. The PI also directs the team. Like a head coach, the principal investigator follows a playbook, which we call the study protocol. The protocol is a set of instructions that everyone in the game must follow. It's the plan for how the study will be carried out. The research staff members are like assistant coaches, and they help the principal investigator. The clinical research coordinator handles the day-to-day activity of the research site, and he or she has easy access to the principal investigator and is the main contact for volunteers. If you have questions about a trial or your health, you usually can ask the research coordinator. So referees help protect the safety of volunteers by making sure that teams follow the rules. The referee reviews the study before it starts. The referee keeps you safe and gives you all the information. The number and type of referees involved in a trial depends on the research being conducted. So every clinical trial is reviewed, approved, and watched over by an independent local committee called an Institutional Review Board, or IRB. It's the law. The IRB makes sure a trial is ethical and fair and that it's not too much risk for volunteers. During this trial, researchers must let their IRB know if there are any changes in the study plan, or if the volunteers experience serious injuries or side effects. The IRB can end a trial if it feels volunteers are not safe. Referees from the federal government are also involved. The Food and Drug Administration reviews studies, inspects research centers, and monitors research groups to make sure they are following federal guidelines. The FDA has the final say on whether or not a treatment is approved. Now let's talk about the most important members of the team, the study volunteers. Volunteers are like the players on the field. Without them, clinical research cannot happen. We need all different types of people to participate in clinical research. You don't even need to be sick. You can be a healthy volunteer. A lot of research involves healthy volunteers. Your friends and families may provide you a support system while you are taking part in a research study. It's good to talk to your friends and families about the clinical trial. They can help you come up with questions to ask your doctor or the researchers. They can also support you while you participate. In the end, it is your job to make the final decision on if you will or will not participate in a study. Everyone has the chance to participate in research. You just have to find the clinical trial that is right for you. Just like a football game, there are rules and not everyone can be on the field at the same time. The research team has a list of requirements for the participants, just like the coaching staff draft players. Both the coaches and the players know the game and agree to work together. So let's talk about eligibility. A 10-year-old would never be allowed to play in a pro football team, right? So in that same way, because we know that they wouldn't be allowed to play on that team because it's too dangerous. So just like in sports, clinical trials have eligibility criteria. There are guidelines that indicate who can or cannot participate in a study. So eligibility criteria ensures that clinical trials is studying the right people under the right conditions. If you are considering a trial, you must be honest with the researchers about your health. Lying or hiding information to get into a clinical trial could endanger your safety and have a negative impact and possibly ruin the study. So let's assume your coaches say you're eligible to play. The next question to ask yourself is, do I choose to play? You cannot say whether or not you want to participate without understanding the rules of the game. What are the responsibilities of the player? What are your responsibilities? How long will the game last? And what are the risks and benefits of playing? The informed consent process is designed to answer all the questions and is required by the FDA and the IRB. This is one of the most important parts of the research, and it's a term you're going to learn and hear a lot about. Before any volunteer can participate in a trial, he or she must read, understand, and sign the informed consent form. This is a long form that lists your rights as a volunteer. It includes details about the clinical trial. It describes your role as a volunteer and any procedures or tests you'll need to have. It will warn you about any known or unknown side effects of the study or drug, and it describes the benefits of participating in the trial. By signing that form, You're signing that you understand the clinical trial and that you are agreeing to follow the protocol. The informed consent form is a complex document. The study staff should go through it carefully with you and answer any and all questions that you have. You should never, ever feel rushed or pressured to sign the informed consent form. It is important to note that the IRB can ask the researchers to translate the informed consent form to multiple languages that study volunteers prefer to speak. As a research volunteer, you have rights. You have the right to understand the purpose, benefit, risk, and side effects of the clinical trial. You have the right to ask any questions and discuss any concerns with the research staff at any time during the trial. And you have the right to full, complete, and clear answers. Most importantly, you have the right to quit the trial at any time for any reason. You are a volunteer and are free to leave the clinical trial if you choose to. The research staff will help you do this safely. So you've heard a lot about clinical trials and your rights and responsibility as a volunteer. Deciding to take part in a clinical trial is a personal decision. What's right for a family or friend may not be right for you. I'd like to talk about some of the risk and benefit that you should consider. So scientists set up their studies so that their research will be fair. They also want the research to be accurate and unbiased. In other words, they don't want their own ideas about what they think should happen into a trial to influence the results. To set up fair studies, to ensure the study is being conducted in a fair way, volunteers may be split into different study groups. This is usually done by chance using a computer program, and that's similar to like a coin toss. The researchers and the volunteer do not get to decide which group the volunteer will be in. This is called a randomized study. Sometimes researchers will go a step further and blind a study. This means that the volunteer and the researcher both do not know which group the treatment or volunteer is receiving. This is actually called a double-blind process. And so in some trials, researchers use the term placebo. A placebo looks like the medicine, but it has no medicine in it. Sometimes the placebo is referred to as a sugar pill. What's interesting is that even though the placebo has no medicine in it, there are times when people who are taking the placebo improve or feel better during a trial. This is called the placebo effect. As a clinical research volunteer, even if you are on placebo, you will be closely monitored. Deciding whether or not to participate in a clinical trial is important. Personal decision for you to make. Here are some of the reasons why people say they get involved in trials. They may say it gets them access to brand new therapies that are not yet available on the market. They may think that it may advance science and help others with their condition. The research staff they may also say that they know that the research staff will observe your health very closely. Let's talk briefly about compensation. Some, but not all, clinical trials will compensate people to volunteer, and they'll pay for things like travel costs and pay for your time and commitment. The amount varies widely. Getting paid should never, ever be your only reason for participating. So all research involves risk, though. There can be physical risk, you may not get better, and you may even get worse, or you may be uncomfortable. Emotional risk is another thing that we like to highlight as a possible thing of a study. The protocol can be demanding, and participation may be stressful. There may also be financial risk. There may be out-of-pocket expenses, such as childcare and or missing work. There's privacy and confidentiality that we also have to think about. When you agree to participate in research, you are giving permission for researchers to collect information about you. Researchers must follow rules that protect your privacy and your information. So be sure to let all your doctors know you are in a clinical trial and that you have a contact number that can reach the research staff in the case of an emergency. Volunteering takes time and effort, and you can work with the study staff to accommodate your schedule. Even if you want to continue to participate, your doctor, the referees, or the company making the new drug could stop the study at any time for any reason. So study volunteers often know that many volunteers drop out because they don't fully understand what they are signing up for. So we're encouraging you to really do your homework. Learn about the clinical trial and ask the right questions. Read all the information provided by the study staff. You may even go online to learn about the potential treatment that's being studied. Take your time. There's absolutely nothing wrong with asking a researcher to slow down or explain something differently. Ask questions. Talk about your concerns with the study staff, your doctor, and your friends and family. Bring a friend or family member to the study visit so they can ask questions too. Try recording your visits or take notes so you can refer to the information and follow questions as needed. If you decide to join a study, you should feel confident that you have made an informed choice. You should feel comfortable that the clinical trial staff will support you and answer all of your questions. Here's a handy way to think about it at every step. You start by becoming aware of a clinical trial. You think you're interested, so you discuss it with your doctor. If you're still interested, you need to know all the details. So you talk to the research staff and find out whether you're eligible. If it sounds like something that's right for you, you can choose to sign the informed consent form. But even while you're taking part in the study, continue to ask questions and decide whether you choose to complete the clinical trial or not. Informed consent is an ongoing process, not a single event. So remember, today's event is an important first step. If you're interested in learning more, I suggest starting a conversation with your doctor. You can get information from local research centers, disease advocacy groups, medical journals, and even conferences. There are also a number of websites devoted to clinical trials. Many patient advocacy groups, academic institutions, and research centers have information about clinical trials on their websites. Search clinicaltrials.org and researchmatch.org offer free services to learn about clinical trials and connect with study teams. Clinicaltrials.gov is a site maintained by the National Institute of Health, the NIH, that includes trial enrollment information. CenterWatch.com lists trials that are enrolling volunteers. In addition, many pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies list active trials on their websites. You can also call 617-725-2750. SysScript provides a free search service designed to help patients find trials that might be right for them. Or you may talk to your doctor, research site, friends, or family to find out resources for you. So research volunteers truly are medical heroes. Without them, medical science cannot move forward. I'd like to sincerely thank you for taking time today to learn about clinical research process, and I strongly encourage you to share what you've learned with your friends, family, and people throughout your community. On behalf of all of us, I'd like to say thank you to the millions of people who give the gift of participation in clinical trials each year, and to the rest of us who admire them for doing so. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Dr. Watson. We appreciate you providing a foundation of information about clinical research. We will open for questions right after our panel discussion, so I just want to encourage you all to share any questions with us through the chat box or emailing awareforall@sysscript.org. We'll keep collecting questions as they are coming through. I'm excited to introduce you to planning team member Amber Holst, who will share a bit more about memory health and ways to keep our brains sharp.
Everyone, thank you so much for joining the very first virtual Aware for All event. My name is Amber Holst. I am the Director of Clinical Operations here at Great Lakes Clinical Trials. We are a clinical trial facility located on the north side of Chicago in the Andersonville neighborhood. And much like volunteering to be here at this event, we look to our clinical trial participants, our volunteers. Half of the work that we do is looking at memory loss research. We are working tirelessly to find ways to either prevent, slow down the progression of, and ultimately cure Alzheimer's disease. So thank you all. That brings me to my point why I'm here today, to talk about the importance of brain health, about memory loss and identifying it earlier. So I don't know if any of you have maybe a friend or a spouse or a loved one that you feel their memory has declined. Maybe you have that concern about yourself. One of the most important things that you can do in any of those situations is to get a baseline assessment done. The reason we do that, and it is offered as part of a wellness checkup, you just have to ask for it, is to get an understanding of where your memory is right now. Then in 6 months or a year, you do another cognitive assessment and you can see if there's been a significant change in how those tests were scored. So one that you can actually administer, you can do for yourself, you can give it to someone else. It's kind of a fun one too. It's called the 1-minute naming test. I like to do it with animals because I just think that's more fun. But basically you would have them get, or you will get a pen, a piece of paper, and you will set a timer for a minute. And then in that minute, you write down as many animals that you can think of. Any animal, you just make a list. When the time is up, you tally up how many animals you or someone else was able to list. And ideally, you would want that number to be over 15. Very good is over 20. So, and even if you found it challenging, you know, it doesn't hurt to get a deeper assessment done, a more in-depth one. So you can do that either with your PCP. You can do that by contacting us. We offer free virtual memory assessments. You can book them online at our website, which is greatlakesclinicaltrials.com. And you can also maybe make some lifestyle changes. There's things you can do to help your cognition. One of the most important ones is making sure that you're getting enough sleep. Not getting enough sleep, you know, causes stress. Stress causes memory loss. And it's something that we can rectify. So a few tips for getting a better night's sleep is make sure that your room is nice, dark, cool, and get rid of the distractions. If you like to read in bed, make sure you're not doing it from your phone or a backlit device, because that's going to take your brain a longer time to kind of shut down to get the proper rest that you need. Another thing that sometimes affects memory loss is medications. Talk to your doctor about the medications you're taking, because sometimes we call that a reversible dementia. By changing that, you might get better cognition. And then another thing that you can do is diet. What's good for your heart is good for your brain. So you may have heard about like the Mediterranean diet, the DASH diet. There's certain foods to incorporate into your weekly routine that are very brain healthy foods. So there's a lot of great resources out there. I wish everyone that they stay happy, healthy, and well, especially during these times. And should you ever want to have a cognitive assessment, there's tons of resources out there to make sure that you have a healthy brain. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Amber. Those are really helpful tips. Next, I'd like to welcome Dr. Lisa Lombard, Research Assistant Professor at the Center for Food Allergy and Asthma Research.
Hi, my name is Lisa Lombard, and I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm a research assistant professor at Northwestern School of Medicine, and I'm in an organization called CFAR. And it's really exciting because we are able to integrate research related to food allergies, asthma, and psychosocial functioning. And so as a psychologist, I'm always interested in and learning about the connection between stress and psychosocial problems and some chronic health concerns. Because one of the things that we're learning more and more about is that if stress exacerbates the problem, then managing stress can certainly help us manage the problem. Currently, we're involved in a variety of research projects, some related to food allergies and asthma, and others related to behavioral health supports, particularly during this time of coronavirus, and as it relates to kids, families, healthcare providers, and essential workers. So I really appreciate this invitation to share some self-care and meditation ideas with you now. If you're able to sit and adjust yourself in a way where you begin to feel comfortable, perhaps in a chair so that you can have your feet firmly on the floor or touching something beneath you. And I invite you to imagine a string gently tied to the crown of your head, lifting your body up a bit so that with the next breath in, you're able to fully appreciate the sensations of breathing in that cool air and then exhaling out the warm air that you no longer need. That's right. And then also imagining a string gently tied to your chest and opening that area of your body more broadly. Shoulders back a little bit, perhaps, as you adjust to an even more comfortable position. And just notice and follow the breath in through your nose and out through your mouth, if able. And as you do that, it might be interesting to imagine the next breath as if a stone is dropping deep into the well of your body. And as you breathe in, 2, 3, and out, 3, 2, 1, you may already begin to notice some ripples of relaxation and comfort flowing throughout your body, especially to those parts that most need some comfort and care. And isn't it nice to know that you really don't need to do anything at all but notice your breath, notice the sensations, allowing everything else to fade off into the background for now. Very good. And as you continue noticing your breath, any thoughts or feelings or concerns or worries which may come, that's common and typical, I invite you to gently return your attention back to the next breath, allowing yourself to allow gravity to do what it does best. Keep you connected, perhaps as you notice those feet touching the ground beneath you, or the floor, touching the earth, the sensation of your shoes or socks, knowing that that connection keeps you connected to others in your community, families, your friends, connected as we're all on the same earth, connected through the activities in which you participate and join, just as the air around us is shared, the earth beneath us is shared too. And so with the next breath in, allowing that ripple of relaxation to wash over our whole body, from the top of our head down to the tips of our toes. Nice to know that this experience of stillness and self-care can last long after the experience here together concludes, so that the benefits go with you forward the hours and days, weeks and months to come, knowing the more you do these practices of meditation and self-care, the better you become at it, and the layers and layers of comfort and connection grow too. And now, in a moment, it will be time to re-alert, to resume our conversations and our learning together. So I encourage you to wiggle your hands and feet and toes, and gradually, if your eyes have closed, to open them to become accustomed to the light again, feeling refreshed and re-energized. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Dr. Lombard. That was a very relaxing and a nice way to practice mindfulness. As we move on to our panel portion of the program, I want to remind everyone of our chat box feature. It's a great way to interact with our speakers and ask them any questions you may have about clinical research. Next, I'd like to welcome our founder and board chair, Ken Getz, to introduce each of our panel speakers.
Well, I want to welcome all of you to our panel discussion today. I want to thank our audience for joining us, and I want to especially thank all of our panelists for sharing your unique perspectives. Every one of our panel members joins us coming from a slightly different vantage point and a different way of being involved in the clinical research process. And so we're going to learn from each of you. Our goal is really to share all of these perspectives to really help educate and inform those who are thinking about and considering clinical research as a potential option for them or a family member in the future. So I'll begin by just introducing each of our panel members, and then we'll turn it over to our panel discussion, and I'll ask some questions to get us started. So our panelists today are Paulette McDaniels, who is a study volunteer, and she'll tell us a little bit more about her background. Jim Butler, who is also a study volunteer. Steve Satek, who is a clinical research professional working out of our research center. Rabia Dadu, who's also a clinical research professional at a research center. Raquel Bruton, who's a clinical research professional at a pharmaceutical company, and Cassandra Smith, who's also a research professional from a pharmaceutical company. So let's kick things off, and I'm going to turn it over to Steve to get us started as we learn about your different perspectives. Can you tell us briefly about how you've been involved in the clinical research process? What are the primary ways that you participate in clinical research?
Great, thank you so much, Ken. So just to answer your question, I've been involved in research in clinical trials for about 30 years. I actually started out as a bench researcher. I'm trained as a biochemist and a molecular biologist, but being behind a bench and being in a lab wasn't the calling for me. I needed human interaction. So I transferred into the clinical site setting, where I served a number of different roles, like clinical research coordinator, site manager. And just back in 2013, I decided to take a leap and open up my own research center. So I am the owner and founder of Great Lakes Clinical Trials on the north side of Chicago. And what I wanted, and I probably should back up, I actually was a research participant in 2 or 3 studies in my career, so I've had a little bit of that viewpoint as well.
Thanks, Steve. Well, let's open it up to others. Perhaps Paulette, can you tell us about your experience with clinical research?
I've been involved in various trials of clinical research for, I can't even remember when I started. I think I started with an osteoporosis study on why African Americans seem to suffer less of that. And then because I have asthma, and I have some very good doctors at Northwestern, I segued into the Lombard study, which is about the effect of asthma on African Americans. Ulysses Butler ran that, and it was just, I feel that it is contributing to making things better for others. So I've done the study of a drug that's just come out, and that was a 5-year study.
Thank you, Paulette. Cassandra, can I sort of invite you to share your perspective as well, a little bit more about your background and involvement?
Sure. So I work for Janssen Research and Development, a pharmaceutical company of Johnson & Johnson, and I serve in a capacity as Director of Diversity and Inclusion in Clinical Trials. I am honored and privileged to really hold this role because what I get to do all day is something that I've loved and I've been involved with for many years, and it's really focusing on health equity through, making sure that clinical trials are accessible to all populations. And so that's really the main remit that I have in my role is making sure that our studies are well participated in by diverse patient populations, and really how clinical trials, Paulette, I love what you just said about clinical trials being a way to have make things better for others, because I think a lot of times when we think about trials, we don't necessarily consider that aspect of it, but that's very important. Some diseases that are studied are familial diseases and are transported down the line in people's families, and so it may not necessarily benefit you to participate, but it absolutely could benefit, someone from your family or your community. So I love that. But that's essentially what we do. We've been at it for about 1.5 years now.
Thanks, Cassandra.
Sure.
Jim, can I draw you in?
Sure. I got a diagnosis almost 4 years ago. I've been in clinical trials pretty much since I began. It is for me, it's an important part of kind of my program and how I stay on top of my diagnosis. I'm currently involved in my second clinical trial. When I was first diagnosed, I was not made aware of from my doctors at Northwestern that they're to engage in a clinical trial. We reached out, and my wife primarily works in healthcare, and she introduced me to it. It's one way of being proactive about my diagnosis.
Great, thanks, Jim. Raquel?
Yeah, hi, my name is Raquel Bruton, and I also work for a pharmaceutical company based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Biogen, and I am in charge of overseeing a few of our global clinical trials. So my main function is to execute and make sure these trials run according to the protocol. But with our changing landscape in the global population, we want to make sure that all populations are included in the trial, because it's important that we know how our drug impacts everyone. And we can't do that unless we get a varied participation from everyone. And this goes back to even the first in human trials. So that PK data that we obtain, we need to see how that works in all different populations, because essentially it helps when the doctors are ready to treat these patients that they have data that supports this treatment. And so the earlier that we can provide that information, the better.
Thank you, Raquel. And last but not least, Rabia will bring you in as well.
Thanks, Ken, and hi, everyone. I feel so privileged to be on this panel and along with you folks. I've been involved in clinical research for about 10 years, both on the treatment side, the recruitment side, and now the research side, which is an interesting part where we work with Chicago Public Libraries in Chicago to look at how do we get folks to understand the basics of a clinical trial, understanding just what it is, and starting from there and meeting them where they are in terms of their knowledge and their attitudes about the trust in the medical community. So we are learning a lot from that and working to develop a web-based tool to help people get more informed about that. And my role is I'm a clinical research associate at the Center for Health Equity Transformation, directed by Dr. Melissa Simon at Northwestern University. It's a fairly new center, 2 years in, and part of the work that we do is this important piece of enhancing diversity in clinical trials. So happy to be part of the team.
Great. Well, again, great to have all of you with us. Paulette, maybe you can now begin our look at what are some of the common misperceptions that people have about clinical research. Perhaps something that you learned where you thought differently before you participated in a trial.
Well, I'm a very an advocate of research, and I don't mean just research from your perspective. I mean, if you're going to do anything, you need to research it before you do. And of course, I have a lot of people in my family that are in the medical field. So they will, go on the FDA and look at all the side effects. But there are some people in the family that are the walking epitome of those misconceptions. Those are the ones that said, I saw Frankenstein and I know what's going to happen. Mad scientists, and then they dig up, they took this drug and the side effects, and that's possible. There will be side effects, but you research it, you have good doctors, you talk to them, they are honest with you, you know your own body. That's the important thing. You have to know your own body, so you are aware when a change or something is happening, and you bring it back to your doctor. This is a team effort. If you aren't working with your doctors and the team that's doing it, nobody's going to get anywhere. So I explained that, yes, there may be side effects. It's your job to note those and let your doctor know. No, the doctors aren't wickedly, evilly plotting the demise of the human race. Otherwise, they wouldn't have anybody to work with, and they would be out of business, So there's that, and then there's they don't really care about us. And that's important to address, that minorities, which is really the majority of people, can feel that everything is aimed toward the minority of people. And that has to be addressed. And you've done it splendidly, all of you talking. But they have to understand this is a worldwide thing. And if one sector of the world gets ill, as we can see, everybody else is going to get ill. So our job, me as the patient or as the person in the study, is to research so we can affect everyone for the better. So that's what I tell my Frankenstein friends.
Thank you, Paulette. Let's open it up. Anyone else want to comment on what you see as some of the common misperceptions and really build on what Paulette has mentioned?
Yeah, this is Raquel Bruton from Biogen. I think another common misconception is that people are actually being asked to participate in the trial. And I think Jim kind of mentioned this in the beginning, where they're not aware that our healthcare professionals make assumptions about their patient population, and they're not really outwardly asked to participate. Then they're not really aware of the level of care they'll receive once they're in the trial. They actually may see their physician more often than they would than their insurance would allow. They may receive additional testing that they wouldn't naturally receive. And so there are a lot of benefits to participating in a trial. You could also be at the top of whatever new technology there is in terms of treatment, in terms of care that you may not receive if you weren't participating in a trial. So our objective, at least from our company, is for the investigators to actually step outside of their comfort zone and approach a patient and ask them would they want to participate, instead of assuming that the patient may be too busy or that the visits may be too often and they can't come. I think we need to leave those decisions to the patient.
I'll jump in there. I had my diagnosis at Northwestern, and I was well plugged in with Northwestern for the first year and was completely unaware that they had a clinical trial going on at their hospital. The SNF trial specifically is what it was. And so my wife found out about it, and I joined in that trial. And I'll tell you, from a standpoint of someone with a diagnosis, an Alzheimer's diagnosis, it's yet one more way for me to be proactive about my condition. It's that's kind of the mantra for everything I do relative to this. Being in a trial is contributing. It's doing everything you can to slay this dragon.
Cassandra, you were going to say something as well.
Yes, I was just going to, maybe echo what Raquel and Paulette and Jim, have just said. I think that a misconception about trials is that it's when there's nothing else, out there that one could possibly turn to. And that may be true that, perhaps a patient has failed on other therapies or hasn't had success, with other medicines that are on the market. But, I think it's not necessarily just a life or death kind of situation. As Jim mentioned, as part of disease management in some cases, to be in the front to get the latest in terms of innovation and technology and a better understanding of how to manage a disease, and just to apply a diversity lens to that, because I think that's part of what fuels the work that I do and Raquel does and other of our sponsor colleagues. There are groups that are being left out of access to these trials, to these innovations, to these advances in medicine, and trials are a great way to get there. So I think it's really important for people. For Paulette, I thank you for trying to redirect people when they talk about Frankenstein and some of those references, because I can appreciate the uncertainty and apprehension, but really by not having an open mindset about it and just saying no, we're cutting ourselves out of life-saving sometimes, or life-altering, life-bettering technology tools advances. So that's maybe just the other thing, that a lot of people think that it's like, well, there's nothing else. Well, maybe there are, but maybe there's something better. So just to offer that up, I hear that a lot, like, well, it's only for cancer or oncology, and not really. There's a breadth of different ways people can participate in research.
And Ken, I'd like to just kind of add to that. One of the things we see at the research site level is a lot of individuals who come to us and think that participating in a research study is very similar to what they experience in going to the regular doctor. And so we take time to actually put the situation in the right perspective, and that it is a completely different thing. You're actually part of a research team. You're actually contributing to the knowledge that we're gaining about how this medication might be used in the real world. So we're collecting information as part of a research project. We still have people every week. They show up wanting to give us their insurance card or their Medicare card. In reality, as a private research center, we don't take any billing. Everything is free at a research center. But it comes down to that. It comes down to how frequent your visits are to the clinic. Sometimes patients are used to coming to their doctor once every 3 months or once every 6 months. Well, in a research study, we tell you what your expected timeline is for coming in, and we focus on safety and making sure that we have enough visits to collect your safety profile of your labs, of physical exams, and those sorts of things. So there's a little more structure, less flexibility in a research study, but higher levels of safety.
Yes, definitely.
Great. Thank you, Steve and everyone. I'd like to just add the one big misconception that we found early on, and I found in my prior work, is that clinical research is not just for people who have a disease or condition. It's for healthy volunteers. You could be perfectly healthy and participate, which is really important when we're looking at control groups, and also getting at, why are you healthy? What keeps you healthy is important to inform future research. We've here probably all heard the word precision medicine or personalized medicine. And there are great efforts like the All of Us research program, which gets at enrolling folks to then be a part of that effort. So I think it's an important aspect to discuss and let people know that it's not just for those with a condition.
So these are all wonderful comments. Some of the other presenters at our AWARE program will touch on where to find clinical trials, how to think about and evaluate whether a trial makes sense for you. But I wanted to ask the panel if you now could put yourself in the shoes of someone who's chosen to participate in a study. What are some of the challenges that people face when they're in a trial, and what do we tell people just in terms of what to expect around staying in a study if you can? Why is that so important? So maybe Rabia, if I could come back to you to kick us off this time, what are some things that we can tell study volunteers who are already in a trial?
I think, yeah, for my part in the work we do, we're really at the forefront of the engagement piece and getting people to understand, why is it important to participate. Once they're in a clinical trial, though, we do work with librarians who we see as the arbiters of truth in these settings, in the environment, meeting them in that social context of like, well, doing that mind experiment. If I join a trial, what happens next? What questions should I have prepared? Can I get out if I don't like what I'm doing or seeing? And the answer is absolutely yes. And that's something that we're working to break down those myths that are out there and their misconceptions. So I think it's important piece is that it's voluntary from day 1, day 35, day 1,000. If it's long term, it's voluntary. So you have that option to get out.
Ken, I'll just mention some of the things that we look at in terms of the obstacles that people have to overcome really depends on the type of trial that we're conducting. We at our clinic do a lot of work in memory disorders, Alzheimer's disease, Alzheimer's prevention. And with that population, we see one of the biggest barriers is transportation and how do people get to and from the clinic. Yeah. So we've set up a system where we can actually provide transportation. We had to work through a regulatory process to make sure that's in the consent form and all those sorts of things. But we found that actually helped not only our screening and getting more people to participate in research studies, but helping people stay in research studies for the long term. So I think it's a huge thing to consider.
That's a great point. Paulette, I saw you nodding agreement with Steve's comment.
Right. I think one of the trials I was in, you had to be a non-smoker, which I am, etc. But you had to be very consistent. And since a lot of people were coming from a distance, from the South Side, etc., it was difficult for them to consistently show up at the beginning. I think it was once a week or something like that. It's easier for me because where I live, I can walk to Northwestern. So that makes it a lot easier. But another thing that struck my mind is one of the questions people worry about is my information from this trial going to be used against me for insurance companies and things like that? So you have to explain it's a blind trial, you'll have a number, but they do worry about that, whether somebody hacks the information and it affects my life later. So I leave it to you guys to answer.
This is Raquel. I'm not quite sure if you want an answer for Paulette's. I can just confirm that our trials are blinded. It's not shared with insurance companies. But one of the obstacles that I wanted to talk about from an industry standpoint, when we're designing trials, we're thinking about the convenience of the patients. So while our medical doctors may want a number of lab tests or lab draws or visits to the physical site, we're also trying to utilize technology to limit the burden of the patients participating in the trial. Do they really need to come to the university or the doctor that often? Can some technology capture the information that we need over the phone or through the computer to make them stay in the trial longer? Let's come to an even pace where it's good for them and good for us at the same time.
Yeah, I'd like to, oh, I'm sorry, Ken.
Go ahead, Cassandra, and then we'll turn over to Jim.
I was just going to say, I would echo that as well. I think, speaking from a sponsor perspective, it's really important to think about the patients as you're designing your protocols and designing your trials, and try to remove as many operational issues. Transportation is one that oftentimes comes up and can be a really big barrier. But just to go back for a second, Ken, to your question about what would we tell trial participants to keep in mind, and particularly as it relates to retention in the trial and being able to stay involved. It's so important for people to communicate if they're having challenges with let's just take transportation, that's an easy one. Maybe something changed in their family dynamic where they're not able to, get a ride to the center or, have access to a vehicle to take them there, whatever that looks like. There's a lot that can be done from a site perspective. Steve, not to infringe on your territory, but you know, that sponsors can also help sites enable patients to, you know, stay the course. And so it's just really important to communicate if there's any challenges that you're having or issues that you're having, so that you never know until you ask. And there really is, there's a lot that can be done, but if we don't know, we meaning sites or sponsors, you know, we can't do much. So feel free to speak up. We're here. I think it's a partnership.
Thank you, Cassandra. Jim, over to you.
I think there's a huge dividend for someone like myself to participate in a trial. I mean, these people become like family in a way. You know, you're in there, you're being infused, you're being tested. I look at it like I'm kind of on the front of what's happening with Alzheimer's disease, and I don't know if my trial at Great Lakes is we don't know if the drug is working or not, but it sure is fun as someone with a diagnosis to be able to be contributing on this front. You know, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't work, but I made a good decision in supporting that effort.
And to your point, Jim, when you feel like you're really part of that team or part of that family, it makes you want to continue to see it through if you can.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's only one thing I don't like about the clinical trial. Every third session, or one a month, the third one, they do a deep dive in cognitive testing. Now, that for me is a serious challenge. When I leave on that day, I'm ready to go home and have a cocktail.
And I think it speaks to some of the points that others made, that there are procedures, there are tests during the trial. Some of them may be a little bit more challenging than others, but they're necessary to really demonstrate some of the critical outcomes or endpoints in the study.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, it's a small ding to have that great experience.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. You know, it goes to what we were talking about earlier too, the difference between your regular doctor visit and a research study visit.
Right.
Sometimes, and Jim knows this very well, research study visits can last 4 to 5 hours in length. When's the last time you went to your regular doctor and they were focusing on your health for 4 to 5 hours? Doesn't happen too often. So yeah. it just goes to show and demonstrate the added level of quality of care, the focus on safety that we're doing in the research setting.
Yeah, and just to jump on Jim's point, it goes to what Cassandra said. You know, that feedback is valuable for us, because does that mean then we would do that assessment on another day when the patient's not at the end of their visit? You know, we like that feedback because it helps us to design a better protocol for the patient. So it's really important that we get that feedback.
And just to jump in, I think it's also helpful for your primary care physician and your other doctors. Once a year, of course, I go on for my yearly and all that sort of thing. And my doctor, Dr. Shinneman, will say, well, we should probably test, and I've done it already, had it last week. Done it already, had it last week. I had an EKG, a heart thing. I had the kidney, I have the blood, I have and she's checking it off and checking it up against her computer and saying, right. It's really helpful for them. So, yeah.
Well, these have all been wonderful insights, and thank you for sharing your perspective. I think now we can open it up for questions from the audience. So we'll start to now review the questions that have been coming into us, and we'll ask them of the panelists to respond in our Q&A.
So we're opening it up now for questions from those of you who are attending our program. We had a couple of questions that relate to how the pandemic has impacted clinical trials. So maybe, Rabia, if I can ask you to kick us off, in your experience, how are clinical trials changing, and what should study volunteers expect if they wish to be in a trial or if they're already participating in one?
Thank you, Ken, and thanks again for having us on the panel to discuss. So when, here in Illinois, the governor instituted the shutdown, I think it was March 14th, as a research team, we got to work right away in figuring out how we were to adapt and modify our protocols to continue our important research. And so what we did with the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, ensuring that any modification that we do is in compliance, but also that once we do adapt our ways and methods of outreach, that was really the biggest barrier, was recruitment for current studies. And so what we did is we leveraged our partnerships with community partners. And for example, we work with Chicago Public Libraries, as I mentioned, and they were very helpful in getting us connected to their, I guess you call them the virtual team, and they did a lot of great programming already online for library patrons. So we got plugged in and got featured on their website. We also created ways for people to sign up much easier, streamline the process of doing that and doing a pre-screening that is part of the sign-up form. And all these things to, of course, keep everyone safe, because we're monitoring the situation as the state reopens in certain scenarios. But it has posed a challenge, and we're learning as we go with different approaches and methods. That's where we are at this point.
Great, thank you. Steve, can I draw you in as well? Just what are things that you're telling study volunteers that might be considering participation at this time?
You know, similar to what was just discussed, we actually did implement some safety standards at our clinic, and we stayed open after the shutdown notice was announced. So we actually have been doing some screening on the phone before patients come in to make sure that they're not experiencing any symptoms. And then when they do come into the clinic, we're doing temperature measurements and also checking for COVID symptoms. A couple of things that we've done at our clinic that some people notice and some people don't is that we've really spread visits out, both from a time perspective as well as location, meaning that we don't put people's appointments on top of each other. We make sure we spread them out so that we don't have multiple people sitting in our waiting room at the same time. We actually we're fortunate that we have a large clinic space, and so we're able to separate out patient visits into different locations throughout our entire clinic. There are some studies that we're doing that have allowed us to do remote visits and telephone visits and those sorts of things. But those are few and far between with our current workload that we have. The primary reason is that there still are safety issues, as we discussed earlier in this presentation. Was, there's safety issues always with clinical trials, and to be able to actually do physical exams, to do brain imaging, to do blood draws, you really need to have somebody with the patient to actually collect that information. So virtual visits are not really appropriate to maintain safety in the way that all of our studies want to do. So we've done some things to switch things around, and we've seen a slower flow of work coming into our clinic, but we also feel like we've actually amped up the safety measures at our clinic.
That's great. Thank you both. And I'm going to now turn it over to Paulette and Jim. Maybe Paulette, you can get us started. Have you had any experiences now during the pandemic that where you've noticed some real changes in the way trials are done? And Jim, and then we'll pass it off to you as well.
Well,
okay.
You go.
So we'll start with Paulette.
Okay. Actually, I haven't been involved in a trial since the pandemic. My last sign up, I was involved in a trial that ran for almost 2 years, maybe longer. And I think I signed out and it finished just before everything got shut down. So what I'm getting now is paperwork and follow-up, but I haven't done any clinical visits.
I see. Jim, how about you? Have you still been participating in your study?
Yes, there was no interruptions at Great Lakes on my study. This next time I'm in there, I have to go on over to Swedish Covenant and get an MRI and a PET scan and that kind of stuff. And I think they had a little trouble getting those slated in, but they did it. So there wasn't any interruption. I go there one Tuesday every month, and that's exactly what I did the last time. And I'll be in there again in the next week or so, I think.
Great. I want to now shift gears. We have a couple of questions that might be best for some of our pharmaceutical industry professionals to start us off in answering. The question really is, why does it take so long to develop a new vaccine or treatment? Raquel, can I ask you to sort of kick us off on that specific topic? And how should people be thinking about why clinical trials take so long?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ken. We all wish that it could be faster, but there's so much analysis that has to be done in terms of even before a human being can actually participate in the trial. We want to make sure that the compound itself is stable, is safe, that the best route of giving this compound to the patient has really been researched before a patient actually receives it. And because safety is at the paramount, we want to make sure that all of those key points are considered before a trial happens. There are different phases. There's a phase 1 where it's first in human. And so those first in human trials are going to be small. We want to make sure that we're not exposing a compound to a large population without first testing it out. And then the phase 2 of the trial is focusing on, it still could be safety and efficacy. And once we get to phase 3, that's where we're going to include the larger population. And because we need to include so many people, many of the trials now are global, which means that there are government agencies that need to know what you're doing. They need to make sure it's safe to their population. They need to know what you intend to do once these patients get in the trial. So there are a lot of paperwork, a lot of vendors involved, and this takes time. And so unfortunately, we always, try to look at the fastest way we can bring the best therapies to the population, but we have to ensure safety and efficacy.
Thank you, Raquel. Cass, anything else you want to add there?
Yeah, I was just trying to think. Raquel, you did a really great job covering that. I don't think there's anything else really to add other than to say that it takes a really long time to ensure, I would maybe say safety and efficacy both, starting with safety first, especially in smaller groups of patients, and then, making sure the drug is efficacious in a broader group of people. But I think Raquel really said everything. Thank you, Ken.
It was very thorough, Raquel. Well, Cass, maybe we can sort of take a slightly different angle. This relates to a similar question that was asked, and maybe Karriem, you can also comment. The question is, will an approved vaccine, once it is approved, will it actually work for all patients? That's a tough one to answer, but there's a lot of ways to think about that, right?
There are, and I'm going to, where I'm going to focus I'll say that that's the goal, right? That the vaccine, once it comes out, it works in everybody. But, as we all heard earlier on in the discussion, my role within Janssen is really to focus on ensuring that we have diversity in our clinical trials so that, we can ensure that it's tested in all populations. Because you want to find out not something is safe and efficacious in, every population, everybody. Once it's in the development process, you don't want to wait until it's on the market and then we start to understand, certain factors that we didn't know because we don't have broad participation. So I will say that is always the goal, and that is also the reason why it's critically important to have a breadth of different people from different backgrounds with different, genetic makeup to be in clinical trials to ensure that's the case.
Terrific. So now I'm going to turn to Karriem first and then Paulette. I wanted to get two different perspectives on this specific question, which is, what are the things that a patient should consider when they're comparing between two different clinical trials for which they might participate? What are things that you might want to consider if you're trying to decide one trial over another?
I understand Karriem's going first.
Yeah. His call might have dropped. Paulette, do you want to kick us off and perhaps he'll rejoin?
Sure. Okay, so the question was, given two different opportunities to be involved in a research trial, what are the things you should weigh when you decide? Do I have that right?
That's it. You got it right.
Okay. First, the obvious one is how much will each trial affect whatever it is that concerns you medically. For instance, if I have asthma, so if I was offered two trials, each one I'm going to assume based on asthma, I would look at, does it affect my particular type? Is it something that's going to work with asthma that's set off by allergies, or is it a genetic? I would look at those factors. Secondly, I would definitely talk to the doctors. And the truth of it is, the doctors that you work with in your trial, the people who are in charge of the research, have a great influence on you. If you get along well with them, if you trust them, if they're willing to explain things to you, if you feel a connection with them, you're more apt to work with them on a study. And third, of course, how long is it going to be? Like I said, I was in one that was a couple of years, maybe longer, but I didn't mind. But I was once offered a trial that was like 10 years. They were doing a study. That's a long time. So all those factors would play in.
Great, Paulette. Thanks for getting us started there. And let me open it up to our other panelists. Does anybody else want to add some other things to consider?
Yeah, sure, Ken. This is Steve. One of the things that I would probably mention too is, if you are looking, let's just take the asthma example. If you're looking at two different asthma clinical trials and they're basically similar in design and being run by the same physicians, you might want to look to see how is the drug being administered. Is it an oral medication? Is it an injection? What do you feel most comfortable with? You can also look at the side effect profiles of the medications that have been tested to date and see, is one of the medications, does it tend to have a greater side effect profile or not? You also want to look at the visit schedule. We talked about the length of the study. I mean, probably let's talk about the length of the study, but there's also frequency of visits. Sometimes studies require you to come more frequently than others, and just making sure that gels with what your lifestyle is like and that you can actually make it to all the visits. So just kind of taking a really good look at the design and the actual medications themselves to see which best fits your needs.
That's great.
Karriem, if I could chime in briefly on
Sure.
that too. I know we briefly kind of touched upon this, but also just being mindful that clinical trials have such a broad definition now. And sometimes that informed consent form you may be involved in a study that may be more exploratory, and that study may not be a treatment study. So it simply may be monitoring you over a period of time for various things, like, for example, the All of Us research study. You can be involved in that study and other trials. So sometimes being involved in one study that may be more what we call longitudinal, going on over a period of time, won't prevent you from participating in another study, but all that can be found out through the consent process and having an honest and deep conversation with that provider, that researcher.
Great point. Any others? What a great way to also frame the value and the importance of the informed consent form. And we did have a few questions where people were asking exactly that. You know, what are some of the things that I can expect to find in the informed consent document? And Karriem, I know you reviewed that in your opening remarks. Let's move now to other aspects of choosing or making a decision to participate. And maybe, Jim, if I can invite you to start us off, are there people you would recommend a patient include in making a decision to participate? Is it a decision that should be made alone, or should you involve other people, and who should those other people be? So, Jim, if you're on the call, if you could kick us off on that, the answer to that one.
I am sorry, I neglected to take it off mute.
No problem.
For me, it was just between my wife and myself. She was actually the one that got me hooked up both with, I was in a trial at Northwestern, the Smith trial at Northwestern for almost 2 years, I think. And then Lisa got me in that, and then we researched together and ended up with Steve at Great Lakes for this Great Lakes clinical trial that I'm currently in and pretty soon to be finishing it, I think, in a couple of months. I think that one's over, and I think they have me slated for another one. But for me, that process wasn't really prompted by any healthcare provider that I had. It was, my wife works in the healthcare space, and she was noodling around and got me hooked up with Northwestern first, and then with Great Lakes, and it's been something that's become kind of like a bedrock thing in my life that I feel really, really good about doing, and I want to continue to do. I'm glad I can contribute to that, and so yeah, that's the way that whole process went for me.
Great. We had asked the question, who do you recommend including in your decision to participate in a clinical trial? And I want to echo some of the comments, Karriem, that you made at the beginning, that it's really important that you get your specialty care physician, you get your primary care physician involved, that they're really part of the decision as well, or other trusted healthcare providers. They're an important part of your team as you get involved in clinical research. And so I wanted to invite others to comment on the importance of having your healthcare providers involved or professionals involved and other people you'd recommend.
Yeah, this is Karriem, and I agree with that sentiment. I think it's important, as I said in the presentation, but I also think that that's something we should talk about is an advocacy across healthcare in general. That carries over into the clinical trial space, and that's that advocate, that person that can advocate on your behalf, whether it be for a clinical trial or for just standard of care. I think that person is important.
I was just going to say, this is Cassandra. I completely agree with that and feel that involving your healthcare network and your healthcare team, if you will, is really, really, really important to making the right decisions. I think sometimes we listen to our cousins and, our aunties and our, friends that live on our street. And granted, there absolutely is a value in having the people close to you also, support you, weigh in. But I think for healthcare decisions, we really have to be more serious with, going to the professional and listening to, their guidance and evaluating what they're saying. Because I know sometimes as a community, we don't always do that. So I would really like to underscore what Karriem just mentioned. And, again, I'm not saying that family, friends, having that support isn't important. It absolutely is. But it's also, very important to make sure that we're seeking the proper medical advice.
Great. One of the related questions we got is, do research centers have an advocate at the center who can sort of specialize in helping patients navigate the clinical research process? One person referred to them as a kind of a liaison. And is that someone that we commonly see at a research center?
like, certainly from a private research center standpoint, we have we call them kind of advocates. They're our patient liaisons, our patient recruitment team, and they can actually help guide patients through the decision process as much as possible by providing the necessary information. For example, in our Alzheimer's work, we might have 3 or 4 studies that are open that are very similar in their designs, but their medications might be different and that sort of thing. So that patient care advocate can actually help guide a person through the decision process.
A lot of the questions we have that are coming in are very logistical. Here's one. Should I notify my insurance company if I'm considering participation in a trial?
This is Karriem. I'll speak to that. Actually, I'll answer that 2 ways. One, just had some recent legislation. The bill that just came out, the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network just advocated, and they actually hosted a town hall forum at our FQHC talking about the importance of Medicaid covering participants' participation in clinical trials. So that was a huge advancement that happened. And the answer to that is yes, and you should also look at the consent form to check the consent process, because part of that conversation should first start with the research coordinator and or the research team, and because that should be discussed in the terms of what are the financial obligations to you as the participant and or your family for participating. And if you feel that that research coordinator, that research team has not adequately answered that, or you just want additional information, then you may want to reach out to your insurance company. But the research team should also be well equipped to answer that, because that's part of the IRB review process. You have to tell the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, what are going to be out-of-pocket costs that a patient may incur, because that goes into the discussion on the risk and benefits of participating in the trial, more so the risk.
That is terrific.
Yeah, I agree.
There were a lot of... Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to echo how that was stated was very well stated. Referring to the consent form is really the way to go. It's one of the benefits, I guess, of being in a private research center. We don't actually take insurance, so we don't do any kind of Medicare, Medicaid. So 100% of our trials are supported by the research grants, and so patients never have to expend any cost for our clinical trials. But I do come from a background where I worked at hospitals, I worked at major medical centers, and there were situations where sometimes there's standard of care costs that get built to insurance, and sometimes there aren't. So I understand there are differences.
One of the questions that appears a few times relates to patients having to play an even more active role now, perhaps with clinical trials that are conducted more remotely as a response to the pandemic, where some of the study drug and other study materials might be sent to the patient's home, or a patient might have to maintain a diary or answer a questionnaire on a device that they might be using. Can I open it up for discussion just to talk about how volunteers should anticipate playing a more active role, and is there assistance that they can expect until they become comfortable being more actively involved in ensuring that the trial runs smoothly?
This is Paulette. Is it all right if I speak?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you're kicking this off, Paulette.
What you were talking about, keeping a diary, whether electronic or written, it's always been in this last trial I participated in. It was, I don't want to say complex, it wasn't. It was just a matter of setting up a schedule response. So you knew in the morning, you would get up, you would check your breathing flow, you would note it written down. The breathing flow that you took also electronically sent information over. You knew when you were going to take your injection for this particular thing, and you knew that you were going to carry all that information with you on your next visit. So I think to some extent, a lot of trials are already set up so that the information is given electronically. And it also reassures you that even if you may miss something or you may miswrite it, there is a record being kept. I think we're probably going to see more and more of that, not only because of the pandemic, but because it is a good way to collect information, but it means also my other doctors, when I go and talk to them, I have a record that I can say, well, this seems to happen, because to me it's really important that without breaking the confidentiality clause of whatever I'm doing, that my other doctors are kept aware of what's happening. So I think that that's something that's going to happen more and more. And it's really good for a lot of people who may not be able to get in physically for a lot of things. That's just my feeling.
I have a feeling, Paulette, that a lot of people share that view or are coming to recognize that extra convenience and the ability to have those records with you wherever you are is really important. Maybe I can open it up to our other panelists if you want to comment on any of that as well.
I will, Ken. It's Cassandra. So I think that's really great to hear, Paulette, your perspective on that. Coming from a sponsor's perspective, you're right. We really are moving more towards virtual clinical trials, direct to patient clinical trials. That whole setting that it still involves a site, piece or site role, but also gives a lot of, power to the participants themselves. So, we're seeing things like, management of medication going directly to patient, the diaries, as you mentioned, having an onus there. And, I'm a patient as well as a sponsor representative and a woman and all these things. And I think that it's really important to have that power to manage my health care the way that is convenient for me. I have to tell you, since the pandemic, I see a specialist, a rheumatologist, and, it's really hard to see your doctors right now. But I was able to set up a telemed visit with her, and it honestly was like the best thing ever for me because, I don't have to drive an hour to go see her. I don't have to then wait essentially an hour to see her once I get to her practice and then drive an hour home if not more through traffic. So I think, thinking about this a little bit more, like what's most convenient for the patients is the way we do need to go. The other thing that I mentioned, Paulette, just to echo, you pointed out something really important, the ability of having your information and you can share that yourself, because sometimes I know that, there are different electronic medical records and they don't all talk to each other, and, people don't always get copied. Your primary care doc may not get copied on one specialist or from one specialist to the other specialist. Things get lost. And so by empowering the patient with their own information, I think that's really important to be able to share, like knowledge is power kind of, sentiment there, that having, control over your own information really allows you to be, play a more active role, I guess I would say, in your own care. So I think it's really important, but I also think, for those participants, bring it back to the trial setting, those participants who would like more hand-holding, that is always available as well. So I think it's finding the right balance, and if there's something, you don't understand or you need some support with, there's always a number to call to get somebody to help, walk you through whatever the process is, be it a diary or, dosing or medication or whatever that is. So I think we're moving more towards that way.
Yeah, and this is Raquel Bruton from Biogen. I just wanted to also add to Cassandra and Paulette's point is that we see that when you try to include all patients, not everyone has a traditional work schedule, so they're not working Monday through Friday, and it actually may be better for them to log on electronically at night to provide this information. And so decreasing patient burden helps with a patient staying in the trial a lot longer and being more consistent and providing the data more consistently. So anything that we can do in terms of the industry sponsor side to help the doctors that are overseeing the trials and the patients that are in the trials is always an advantage to everyone involved.
Well, I want to thank all of you. Believe it or not, that was the fastest 30-minute open Q&A where we've come up to the end of our time. And I think that this has been just a marvelous panel. You've all been terrific. We should really go on the road. We could be talking for about so many topics. You've just been wonderful. So thank you, Paulette and Jim, Steve, Rabia, Raquel, Cassandra, Karriem. Thank you so much. I'm now going to turn it over to the SysScript team, and I just want to mention that we still have a lot of other questions that have come through, and we will answer them and get responses back out to people who didn't have a chance to have their question answered. So again, this is Ken Getz, and I want to thank all of our panelists, and I'm going to turn it back over to SysScript.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
And thank you again to all of our speakers today for volunteering their time. This has been very informative, and we really appreciate everything that you guys are doing to improve public health.
We hope that this is just the start of the conversation. All of our event materials can be found at awareforall.org. They can serve as a guide with information about clinical trials here in Chicago, as well as information about clinical research participation. We will also plan to follow up after today's event with a survey. We'd really appreciate if you could share your feedback with us as we continue to enhance this virtual version of the Aware for All program. I'd like to take a moment to recognize the medical heroes here in the audience tonight. Thank you for helping to find a better way to diagnose, prevent, and treat diseases that improve public health and advance medical science. We hope you feel recognized as a valuable partner in this process. Without you, we would not have been able to conduct new research to discover new cures and treatments. We are grateful for your gift of participation. Thank you all again for joining us this evening for our clinical research education program. We look forward to keeping in touch, and have a great night, everyone.